Well, today is April the 19th. It's a very significant day in tyranny. It was the day that the British moved against those that conquered in Lexington to take not only their muskets, but cannons. It's also the day that the Nazi Panzer Division got tired of fighting the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and burned them out completely. And it's the day that the U.S. government got tired of the Waco siege, and many of us believe burned those people there to death. And we need to take a look at that and understand the implications that it has for us today. And some people do. Let's look at this clip earlier from someone who was looking at Obama's gun control legislation, a mayor in New York.
Most people are law-abiding citizens and may go ahead and sell those or turn those over, but you're going to have a faction of people that are going to take a stand. And I can just predict a Waco-style standoff in some rural area, and it's not going to end well.
Now, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his army, that was the point at which people realized Rome had become a dictatorship. And so that's become something of a metaphor. And you know, the crossing of the Rubicon for the American government, in my opinion, for me personally, happened before September 11th. Now, September 11th was used to create a legal framework and to change many fundamental things legally in our country. But to me, the Rubicon was crossed from a republic into a military dictatorship when the Branch Davidian compound was burned down. And that whole siege, for me, was a really kind of an awakening. And I guess perhaps it was because the age that I was at that time. But we have someone with us today who has shed a great deal of light on that. He's essentially worked on that for the last 20 years. He's investigated this. He's uncovered Freedom of Information requests and put together a large story, a detailed story about exactly what has happened there. His name is Mike McNulty, and he's a film producer, and we're going to talk to him about his films on the Waco disaster. Well, Mr. McNulty, it is wonderful to talk to you. I can't tell you how much your documentaries have meant to me, and as I said before, this is the point for me at which I realized that America had crossed the Rubicon.
Well, thank you, David. I'm happy to be here with you today.
I'd seen the very first movie that you did. We had video stores at the time, and we did everything we could to get people to watch this. At the time this all happened, I was an activist with the Libertarian Party, and there wasn't anything like the internet. But we were passing around information as it was unfolding in real time, and we were watching, just as we are this week, we were watching the difference between what the mainstream media and the government was telling people and what we were getting from eyewitness reports. And for us, we had this experience 20 years ago, and we were looking at this and saying, this doesn't add up. They just lied about this. They just contradicted what they just said. We saw them demonizing David Koresh, saying that they were coming in to protect the women and the children, to protect the children, and then they wind up burning the children up in this thing. It was just amazing for us. We didn't have the facts that surfaced later in your documentary because you did a lot of research and Freedom of Information requests and that sort of thing, and unfolded this over a number of years. Tell us about the progress of that. You've done 3 documentaries on Waco.
Our friends at the FBI and the Justice Department claim that I was an underhanded dirty dealer. And the truth was, I used something that for them was sort of a dirty trick because nobody had ever bothered to use this tool in the past. They operate on a 1-week news cycle. The events at Waco lasted 51 days, and so I got on the project at the conclusion of events and worked on it from there. But the secret tool that I used was a little thing called time. Instead of rushing right out so I could beat the competition to the next deadline, I simply took almost 3 years to make the first film, and about half that much, about 18 months, to make the second, and another year to make the third. And the process was invaluable because I had the opportunity to make the acquaintances of, time had passed, perceptions had changed, and feelings about what had happened had changed. And so it allowed me to, for example, become acquainted with a gentleman by the name of Bill Johnson, who was the assistant U.S. attorney who planned the original Waco raid on February 28th. and led it. And he was, by the time I got to him, beginning to have some real pangs of conscience about what happened. And in the meantime, the court system had had its way with the Branch Davidians, completed the cycle. And so I suggested to Bill, after we got to know each other a little bit, sure would be nice if I could go into the evidence locker that you guys hold there at the Texas Ranger headquarters and sort of look around at the evidence. Think I could do that? He said, well, everything's done. Sure, why not? So we went on a little visit. One of the earlier submissions on my blog site covers that, shows pictures of the results, and talks about the things we found in there, including the so-called missing front door. There's a lot of misinformation that we had to wade through, starting with the famous flamethrower tank video that was just completely bogus. But that led to other information that we found that led us to other things that helped develop what we now know as Waco, the Rules of Engagement, Waco, a New Revelation, and the FLIR Project.
You know, it's interesting because, as you said, as this was unfolding, we were seeing the same kind of misinformation from the government and the press, backpedaling, changing the story, demonizing people. And to put this in context, we have to understand that just a few months prior to this, before the Clinton administration took office, this was at the very beginning of the Clinton administration. This all began in March after he was sworn in January. But it was back, I think it was after the election, wasn't it, that Ruby Ridge had happened. And of course, it was all the same players, the same actors involved. This, again, is not a Democrat-Republican thing. This isn't necessarily a Clinton thing. It's kind of a bureaucracy thing. Now, the people that were the top, Janet Reno and the others, they absolutely have criminal culpability in the lies and the decisions that they made. But this is something that was pervasive throughout the bureaucracy, wasn't it?
Well, I'm working on a new project that the working title is The American Gestapo. And it focuses on agencies within the federal bureaucracy. And I won't name them all right now, but there's some.
We don't have the time, right?
Well, it's a long list.
There's so many.
The fact of the matter is that, you know, presidents change and directors of agencies change. And sometimes they don't, from one administration to another. For example, Mr. Mueller, the director of the FBI, you know, he's been around for Republicans and Democrats. And the fact of the matter is, that's where the real nitty-gritty happens. Now, you pointed or alluded to the contravention of statements made to the press versus actions taken on the ground. One of the problems with the Waco business from an administrative point of view relative to law enforcement is the nature of the relationship between negotiators and negotiating staff and in this case, the hostage rescue team or the tactical or SWAT team people. If you get into an elongated situation, you're going to find conflict develop rapidly between negotiators and the people on the ground trying to enforce the rules. Now, this is not in their defense. This is to understand how the system works. So the longer you go in a standoff situation, for example, the more exertion the hostage rescue team or SWAT people are going to put onto the subject of getting you out of wherever you are, versus what the negotiators are trying to do, which is a compassionate resolution where nobody gets killed.
But as we were saying, as we were speaking just before the interview started, and talking about this idea of Caesar crossing the Rubicon and the U.S. becoming some kind of a police state dictatorship, you were saying that, in your opinion, this isn't, we think of dictatorships as being one man, like Julius Caesar or Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, and yet what we're seeing here in this country, and perhaps that's what you're going to be covering in your next documentary, is that it really is a systemic thing that transcends necessarily one individual person, and it's systemic throughout the bureaucracy, isn't it?
Yeah, well, a lot of people like Ronald Reagan. And he tried to go in and change the system. And he came back to report to the American people, you can't change it. It winds up changing you. Mm-hmm. Okay? You have to remember that the first president of the United States that violated posse comitatus was Herbert Hoover with the bonus marchers in the 1930s, mm-hmm. In which 9 World War I veterans were killed, and they were run out of their encampment trying to get their bonuses from Congress by none other than General MacArthur and 2 majors that worked for him. One's name was Dwight David Eisenhower, and the other one's name was George S. Patton. Mm-hmm. And they used tanks and cavalry and ground troops to run these people out at the point of bayonets and rifles.
Right.
And there's a reference to that on the blog site. And then along came another president who had this riot going on down in Talladega, Florida, involving the Muriel boat people back in the 80s. And the prison guards couldn't get things under control. They brought the hostage rescue team in and from the FBI. And interestingly enough, the man in charge of explosives and breaching at that incident in Talladega, the Talladega prison, was the same man who was in charge of explosives and breaching at Waco, which, if you look at the blog site and the film, you'll see were used.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your, I don't want to run out of time here before we talk about your documentaries. Let's get an overview of your documentaries, because you've done so much detailed research here, and it even overflows a series of 3 documentaries. You've got a huge amount of information on your website, which is copsproductions.com. That's copsproductions.com. And you go down through there, and it's essentially kind of like the sort of supplemental material you might find on a DVD, but it's additional research, text, pictures, videos that you've got there, 6 different postings at least at this time of that, right?
They're fairly lengthy.
Yes. Now, and you started originally, as we said, your first movie was Waco Rules of Engagement. Then you followed up on that subsequently in a few years with Waco, A New Revelation, and then you did the Flare Project after that. And the DVD that we're now starting to sell here at Infowars.com has those last 2 with the most comprehensive research in there. And tell us a little bit about what, one of the big issues is who lit the fire, just like we're hearing with the Chris Dorner thing. And here we are 20 years to the day that everyone was incinerated, men, women, and children. When I came to Austin, I stopped by there, and it was just such a seminal moment for me. I had to stop by and see the Waco, and we want to call it a compound because that's just been drilled into our brain from the incessant repetition on the media, but it was their home. And to see the graves of these people, all different ages, all different ethnicities, and so many children there, and we have heard nothing but the repetition of the tragedy in Newtown, and this is far more extensive than the tragedy in Newtown in terms of the number of victims and the way that it happened, and yet it's largely ignored. Nothing is going to be said about that, I'm sure, today. As
President Clinton said famously in the Rose Garden, there were 27 Davidian children killed there, but after all, they were Branch Davidians.
Yeah, right. Right. And they were effectively able to do that in public opinion, too. So many people I knew, even Christians that I knew, had such a hardened attitude towards us. They had just shut off their compassion towards these deaths because they didn't like David Koresh's theology. He had some messianic ideas about it. But that was no reason to support the execution of him and the children that were there. That was absolutely insane. And you start out, your blog number 6, you start that out talking about the parallels with the Mormons. What happened with the Mormons?
Indeed, at Hans Mill in 1837. Probably one of my best lines was during the time I was doing a lot of television, was that in reference to the children and the overall events, I really thought they stopped burning men, women, and their children at the stake as social heretics back in the 7th century. but I guess they haven't.
No, they didn't. They essentially burned them in the media, and I saw so many people, as I said, Christians who were like, yeah, well, they were crazy anyway. And it's like, even if they were crazy, you don't burn people if they're crazy like that. I went to the Libertarian Party National Convention in 1993, just a few weeks after the Waco incident had ended and the fiery deaths of all these people. And as we were going through, it was held in Salt Lake City, and we took the Mormon tour. And they have all these dioramas and everything talking about their history and how they were persecuted. And I came out of there and I said, this is exactly what just happened at Waco. And the Mormons who were there, for the most part, said, what? What? Yeah. They didn't even, they were in such a bubble, they didn't even know what had happened with them. I said, you better wake up, because it happened to your people, it happened to these people, and it can happen in America again at any time to anyone.
Well, if the truth be known, David, I am a Mormon, and I was fully aware of the bubble you referred to, and the whole thing about, I explained this at the beginning of blog number 6, what brought me to want to do something more than just watch events pass was a remembrance of that piece of history in 1837 when the Mormons were, a group of Mormons were trapped by the state militia in Missouri and forced into a log grist mill and had the doors barred on them, and the men dismounted and put their muskets through the chinks in the logs and fired into the interior until everybody inside was dead or wounded.
Yes.
You know, all that just because the lieutenant governor of the state, William Boggs, issued a little thing called an extermination order that was not repealed until about 3 or 4 years ago.
Wow.
And the extermination order was very much just that. If you were a Mormon found in the confines of the state of Missouri, you would be summarily executed, and they did.
And I see that same attitude now. 20 years ago, it was that same attitude that I saw with evangelical Christians towards the Branch Davidians. And now here we are 20 years later, and guess who's in the crosshairs of the military and the intelligence agencies? It's evangelical Christians are considered to be part of right-wing extremists. And I said at the time, I said, if you don't stand up for these people, it's the famous saying that's become almost a cliche, going back to Nazi Germany, where the priest, I believe, said, you know, they came for this group and I did nothing, they came for the next group and did that. Then they came for me and there was no one left because they had taken everyone. I said, that's going to happen in this country. And here we are 20 years later, and you see the U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Rich says that the American Family Association, the Family Research Council, probably two of the most mainstream evangelical organizations out there, that these people do not share Army values and they are hate groups. And if they're hate groups, of course, you can act hatefully towards them. You can do anything towards them. That's just shy of declaring them as a terrorist because we don't have any clear definition of what a terrorist is, do we?
We talked about this at the beginning of the show. The issue is not, do we have a dictator? No, we have a dictatorial mindset institutionalized within the agencies like the FBI and the BATF. And the nature of the game here is to stay in business as an institution, they always have to have an enemy. So now they've gone into the business of creating their own, and it'd be us.
That's right, that's right. And their willing allies in all of this is the media that is using themselves, letting themselves be used essentially as a propaganda institute. I was absolutely, to keep this in the current context, as we've watched this Boston Marathon bombing unfold this week, we were absolutely flabbergasted when they identified these two guys, not showing any pictures. They said they didn't when they were asked at the press conference. You have video of them. When did they put the bags down? Oh, we don't know. Maybe it was a couple of minutes before it went off. Do you have pictures of, well, we might have those later. And then as they released these pictures, Leanne McAdoo was the first one in our group to notice that one of these guys had the wrong color backpack. And then CNN comes on later that night and says, well, this is how that could have worked out. I mean, they're created, and they essentially created what I call the Madriosky theory of the bombers, where you've got a backpack inside of a backpack and then a bomb inside of that, you know, and say, well, he could have had a gray backpack inside the black backpack, and then he could have had a bomb inside of the gray backpack. It's just absolutely ridiculous to see the hoops that they will jump through in order to support the official government story. And we saw that with Waco 20 years ago, and we saw that unfolding. As I said, the internet was not in place yet. A few people were passing information around.
An FBI agent by the name of Robert Ricks that was conducting the daily Dog and Pony show. And a good friend of mine, James Tate, from Soldier of Fortune magazine, was there having a great deal of fun just poking and prodding these guys, and including Jeff Jamar, the FBI agent in charge, special agent in charge. And they were constantly, if you watch the films that I've done, it's a constant theme throughout all the films that we've done that, okay, the government said they did this. They carefully removed the vehicles from outside of the building in order to make sure it was safe for the Branch Davidians to come out. Well, then we showed the videotape of a Bradley fighting vehicle. I didn't know they could travel quite that fast, going about 55, 60 miles an hour, hauling across the front of the building, and it drives right through a beautifully restored El Camino, a red El Camino pickup, and just crushes it. And yeah, that's how they're carefully removing these people's property, right?
Yeah, right.
Of course, the Branch Davidians were watching this. They understood what the message was.
Yes, and it must be said, because it was said at the time, and these were the sorts of things that were in existence and being passed around that the media wasn't telling anybody at the time, that David Koresh had issues with the law, but he had always been friendly. They had the local sheriff would come out and he would go in. They would have due process that we come to expect in America, where they have a trial and he's able to defend himself. And he had been found innocent of charges of child molestation and other disputes that had occurred with other members there. And yet, why wouldn't they follow that procedure? Why would they do a full-on raid with everybody there, with the media in place, and call out showtime? It was pretty obvious that they were trying to do some public relations. It was a misguided public relations thing, I guess, in terms of trying to get back some respect and fear after what had happened in Ruby Ridge. It was such a train wreck.
Actually, David, it was a dog and pony show purely intended for the benefit of the United States Congress at the next hearings that were to take place later that summer, so as to retain within the confines of the BATF budget their so-called national SWAT teams, which were teams that were present at Waco on February 28th.
Still building their empire. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of the people involved here. You had mentioned to me just before we went on air about how the names don't change, do they? Talk about Eric Holder. What was Eric Holder's role in this? He's got a long history.
Well, the current Attorney General was then a Deputy Attorney General to Janet Reno, his idol. How do I know it is his idol, or she is his idol? Because there's only one picture that hangs in the Attorney General's office today, and that's a painting of Janet Reno, and he proudly displayed that in an interview about a year ago.
That's pretty creepy.
And so Mr. Holder's role in Waco, I have not been able to determine if he played a role in the actual events. My impression is that it was the whole system within the Justice Department was short-circuited. Janet Reno was left hung out to dry. Things were handled by Webster Hubbell, who was the Deputy Attorney General at that time, and they were controlled from the White House by Mrs. Clinton and Vincent Foster. So all of that has some detail in it in Waco, A New Revelation. But the point is that Mr. Holder was a needed shill, I should say, after events and after we released details from the upcoming newly released film Waco, A New Revelation, and the press got it and ate it up, because one of the things we accused the FBI of doing was lying about the use of pyrotechnic devices at Mount Carmel on April the 19th. And so some members of the press got a hold of it and asked Mrs. Reno, or Miss Reno, about the use of these pyrotechnic devices that this filmmaker had discovered in the evidence locker in Austin. And boy, that set her off, and she went crazy. She sent the U.S. Marshals to the headquarters of the FBI hostage rescue team at Quantico, Virginia, And in their searching of the FBI's offices, which is a really strange thing, they discovered additional videotapes that they had claimed that they didn't have, which involved FLIR. And they also discovered photographs.
Let's put that. That's forward-looking infrared radar.
Forward-looking,
so
not radar.
It would show. Sorry, yeah.
Not radar.
What is the R? What is the R there?
Infrared.
Infrared. Okay, thank you. Sorry, yeah. And what that does, that shows a thermal footprint, so they can basically.
It's a thermal imaging system.
Right.
And the fact is that they also discovered evidence of pyrotechnic devices that indeed had been used by the FBI. So Miss Reno had to recuse herself because she had already testified before Congress that no pyrotechnics had been used. So she recused herself and appointed her deputy, her new kissy boy, Mr. Holder. Oh, that's a terrible thought. As the Deputy Attorney General in charge of the aftermath investigation, which is sort of like asking the wolf to guard the sheep pen after the sheep.
Oh, yeah. And he's been richly rewarded with that by the bureaucracy in subsequent years with his moving up the ladder. So, Mr. Holder was the man responsible for conducting the aftermath investigation and supervising the special counsel, Mr. Danforth. Now, they'll tell you that Mr. Danforth simply reported results. He wasn't supervised, but I know better than that. The fact of the matter is Mr. Danforth did do a so-called recreation at Fort Hood, Texas. It was a sham. We found out about the sham and how they did it in detail, and we produced a little film called The FLIR Project, which is the second film included in this 2-disc set commemorating the 20th anniversary of Waco. So you get a twofer on this one. And before we're nearly out of time, I want to give people an idea of the kind of detailed research that you do, because you've got a big picture of what's going on here, and you fill in the details, many of which took years to come out. And some of the details that are in here are technical details that are very interesting, just like you got the FLIR tapes. Tell us a little bit about what you found out about methylene chloride, and tell what methylene chloride is and what you found out about it.
Well, if your wife has ever nagged you, or maybe it was the husband nagging the wife, to refinish Aunt Bessie's old chest of drawers, the poor things were covered with 250 coats of old paint. The wife sent you down to the hardware store to get some paint stripper, chemical paint stripper, and it comes in a bottle that says methylene chloride. Well, methylene chloride has some very interesting properties. It's very toxic. You don't want to get too much of it on your skin at all. And the other problem with it is that when you put it on a set of desk of drawers, a chest of drawers, it certainly eats off the paint and everything, but it develops a horrendous amount of vapors, fumes, and it warns you right on the bottle, you know, do whatever you're doing with this stuff in a well-ventilated space.
Yes.
Well, why is that? Well, if you read the hazard data safety sheet provided by Monsanto, the makers of methylene chloride, right there in bold print, it says vapors are highly flammable. Now, you might recall the testimony given by all the federal fire experts about the use of the methylene chloride as a solvent for the CS gas particulate. CS gas is not a gas, it's a powder, and it's microfine, 2 microns in size, these little particulate pieces. And in order to get it into the room, you've got to get it in there either by pyrotechnic means, where a stick that's been made of this stuff burns and the smoke carries the particulate into the atmosphere. The problem with that is that starts fires. And they didn't want to start fires, at least that was the story. So what they used was methylene chloride, mixing it in with the CS gas particulate, dissolving it as a solvent would, And so that they loaded it into little rockets, white rockets with a blue head, and they were 40 millimeter in diameter, and they'd fire them through M79 grenade launchers. That was one method of insertion. The other method of insertion, is shown in the film, was they put it into pressurized tanks, pressurized with carbon dioxide, and in a liquid form, methylene chloride with the CS suspended in the methylene chloride solution. When you spray that in the air, the particulate did an interesting thing. Methylene chloride does what it always does. It evaporates very quickly, and it leaves the CS particulate suspended in the atmosphere. Quite ingenious. The problem was that they didn't read the Monsanto hazardous data safety sheet about the vapors, or if they did, they ignored it. And when that happened, you're talking about dozens of gallons of this material poured into the building from 6 a.m. to from 6 a.m. until noon. Interesting things happen. Those vapors build up. There was a 30-mile-per-hour constant wind.
Yes, they waited till a day it was very windy, yes.
Extremely windy, the windiest day of the year, actually. Mm-hmm. And then we decided, wait a minute, okay, so they pumped the building full of this very flammable material. The building itself was a fire trap looking for a place to happen. Mm-hmm. The Branch Davidians had their own plan about starting a fire to keep the tanks out if they drove the tanks into the building, which the FBI promptly did during the course of the 6 hours of demolition on the building. And so between at least one Branch Davidian that we were aware of, starting a fire after the first fire started and the second fire started by means of, well, let me go down the list. The first fire started in the upstairs bedroom at the southeast corner of the building at a little after noon. The tank inserting the CS methylene chloride mixture had just emptied a complete bottle into that room. At that particular point, according to the FBI 302 reports, several FBI observers close at hand to the building saw a Branch Davidian dressed in a black ninja suit, as they called it, come to the opening torn in the wall and fire at the tank. I believe he fired an AK-47 at the tank in frustration more than anything else. And when he did, within less than a minute, that room was engulfed in flames, and we saw the flames coming out that window. My contention is that that gentleman was the point of ignition of the first fire starting in that bedroom. It was an ignition of the methylene chloride and the CS gas particulate in the air column in that room that had just been pumped in by the tank. And he fired, and to prove this, we tested the methylene chloride. And at the website, the blog site, there's a section there that has video from those tests that we did. We didn't include it in the FLIR project because it wasn't relative to gunfire per se, the gunfire issue. It was more relative to the setting of the fire. And we were going to add it later, didn't have the money nor the time to do so. So I decided to put the material up on the blog site. But we take methylene chloride in spray bottles and spray it in the open in front of an M16 that's being fired about, 3-4 feet in front of it in the air column. And when that gun goes off, you see the muzzle flash, but then you see the ignition of the methylene chloride in the open atmosphere on infrared. And it produces like a 30-foot long, huge flame. Now, that stuff burns very hot, and it burns much like alcohol does when it ignites. And in fact, in daylight, it's very hard to see the flames from the methylene chloride ignition.
Well, that's just a sample for our audience of the kind of detailed information and research that you've done in your series of films. And if for no other reason, this is such an important and relevant event in our country's history, because to me it has the elements of a government that kind of teeters back and forth between maliciousness and incompetence. and you're always kind of trying to guess, where the needle is. Has it switched over into something that's absolutely, totally premeditated and malicious, or are they just kind of Keystone Cop cowboys? What's the difference? And so it kind of seems like it teeters back and forth. But you did a lot of research. You did your own research, like you said, with this chemical, as well as Freedom of Information Act. You took a long time to put all this stuff together. And I guess from the time that it happened in '93 until the last documentary that you did, the FLIR project, that was 8 years. And now you put that together, and you're continuing to do research on your website. That is copsproductions.com. And I really appreciate and thank you for the work that you've done. And this is something that people need to look at this, because the way our government operates today and the way the media operates today has not changed. And that's why when we look at these issues and we see a lot of these hallmarks type of things coming, even though people criticize Alex Jones and InfoWars for jumping on this and calling BS when we see some of these things here, but we have seen this method of operation for a long time, and we know that they have a motivation to do these types of things from a bureaucratic standpoint and from forwarding their legislative agenda. Final remarks, Mr. McNulty?
One of the things that really motivated us to re-release the films at this time is, of course, as everyone knows, all of the insidious gun control issues that have been tried to be foisted onto the American people, either at the federal level or at the state level, like the state of New York and their alleged assault weapons ban. The beauty of that, in my mind, is that the people are resisting. They're saying, no, we're not going to do that. And it really has ticked off the powers that be, including Governor Cuomo. I think it's important for people to understand the necessity to resist, but also to be selective in how they do it and know what the counterpunch might be from the federal government. And the best example of that I can find relative to gun control issues, which was central to the Waco incident, is the Waco incident. How the government behaves, what their tactics are, right down to the military-style tactics that were employed. And to understand...
Yes, you can either wait for them to come pick up your guns, or you can fight back when they come to your house, or is there another alternative that you found?
In the blog site, I hope people read it. There is an alternative. I don't want anybody to go and turn in their guns. That's garbage. On the other hand, I don't want them to have to face, at least not unwittingly, the wrath of the federal government, as did the Branch Davidians. What I suggest is that you have a stock of money on hand for attorney's fees. You hire an attorney. You make sure you know your county sheriff. You go down to the county sheriff when the time comes, after you've secured your weapons, and you submit yourself to the federal authorities at the sheriff's office with lots of TV cameras and microphones, and under the supervision of the sheriff and your attorney being present. They'll take you into custody. They'll lock you up, book you, all that good stuff. And, the truth is, a judge may not like the idea that you've secured your guns as opposed to turn them over to the federal authorities, but I don't think I just turned them over. And then that means that he may deny you bail because you haven't given the guns over, so on and so forth. The point is, you've done it through the legal system. It will tick off the ATF folks big time because they didn't get to go play their SWAT team games. And you'll fit your family and yourself will generally be safe under those circumstances. But you will have the cost of resistance is going to be the cost of the attorney fees and court and all the things that can happen if you're found guilty by a group of citizens who aren't informed of what the real Second Amendment is.
Yes, and that's why it's very important for us to get fully informed juries back, because that's at the point where the rubber meets the road. They have to at some point try to enforce these unconstitutional, or at the very least, these unreasonable laws. And if your fellow citizens will not stand for the unreasonableness of whether it's alcohol prohibition, or whether it's sending somebody to jail for decades because of marijuana possession, or it's sending somebody to jail for life because they've got certain firearms in their possession, if your fellow citizens know that it is their duty as well as their right to judge the law as well as the facts, then we're all in a much, much better place. That's very, very important. And I absolutely agree with you. We have to fight this through the legal system as much as we can, and we need to make sure, though, that the legal system is going to work, and I think we need to do a lot of work on fully informed juries.
Well, I would agree with you, and I'd also point out that the tactics employed by the federal agencies involved have not really changed. They haven't really learned anything from what happened.
Yes, and that's why your documentary is so relevant today. And we even see many of the same actors now still in positions of authority, but in positions of much higher authority, Eric Holder being one example. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and thank you for your research and your work on this. This is a very, very historically important piece of work. People are going to be talking about this for a very long time and analyzing what went wrong in America. Your documentary series is going to be a seminal piece in that. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Well, it's very, very important that you, this is the documentary, you can get it on our site, and it's very important that you educate yourself and that you educate other people. As Mr. McNulty said, the way our government operates is not any different than the way it worked 20 years ago. And it's one of the reasons why we were so quick to point out that things didn't look quite so right with this marathon bombing here. We have to understand how the government is operating, and we have to educate the public, or they will get away with it time and time again. And if they can get away with this kind of conduct that borders between incompetence and malevolence, we have to stop that. And at some point, we can only do that through education. And so the way that you can help with that, educate yourself first, look at the detailed research that Mr. McNulty has done in this series of films and these Freedom of Information requests. It's a very detailed picture as well as a large overview picture. And you can find that at InfoWarsShop.com. You can get a copy there and pass that around. Well, that's it for tonight. Tune in on Monday for the InfoWars Nightly News at 7 Central.
Hi, Ted Anderson, president of Midas Resources. With over 30 years of experience in the precious metals business, I can tell you without a doubt, we are facing the most dangerous and volatile times, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Peace of mind is gold and silver. Now is the time to invest in gold. When it comes to bullion coins, our prices are competitive and the closest to melt. If it's numismatics you're looking for, we have some of the best deals out there. Visit MidasResources.com today or go to Infowars.com and click on the link to see our daily specials. Here's an example of one of our long-term specials we've been offering for more than a year. 2 silver dollars from the turn of the last century, plus 2 powerful films, The Obama Deception and The American Dream. We also add in the book Dishonest Money, all for $72 and free shipping. The most trusted name in precious metals is Midas Resources. Call 1-800-686-2237 or go to Infowars.com. I'm Ted Anderson with Midas Resources.
We are now only entering the edge of a global financial superstorm, the likes of which the planet has never seen. Here in the United States, the private Federal Reserve is giving more than $85 billion of taxpayer money a month to themselves and other offshore foreign banks. And the worst part is, we have to pay the bank's interest on the money we give them. There is now a race between the global central bank mafia cartels to see who can devalue their country's currencies the fastest. We are already seeing big increases in inflation at the grocery store and the gas line. This will eventually lead to hyperinflation. More than a dozen top globalists like George Soros have been buying record amounts of gold while at the same time bad-mouthing it to the public. Don't just listen to what they say, watch what they do. For more than 6,000 years of recorded human history, gold has been the ultimate hedge against uncertain times and inflation. Before investing in metals, it is important to do your own research and find a reputable company. Midas Resources has the highest Better Business Bureau rating of an A+. Unfortunately, very few precious metal companies can boast that. Midas Resources has assembled one of the most educated, researched, and professional teams of brokers in the industry. The evidence is overwhelming. In uncertain times, gold and silver is safe harbor. Now is the time to invest in gold. Call 800-686-2237 and Midas Resources will mail you 10 reasons to own gold absolutely free. No shipping. It's absolutely free. And finally, Ted Anderson wants to challenge you to find any deal that comes close to his 2 silver dollars at cost with free shipping with 2 free films and a book for $72. That's more than $160 value for $72 shipping included. Click the link at Infowars.com to go to the MidasResources.com specials page. Brought to you by MidasResources.com and Ted Anderson, the trusted name in precious metals.